Hey, everybody. Welcome to our webinar on the Quarry here at City Connections, which is our Impact Accelerator, our Incubator, and our Leadership Academy. I want to introduce you to my good friend, Justin Buck. Buck, what's up?
Hey, man. I'm glad to be here with you. I'm really excited about launching the Quarry at City Connections with this introduction to our Accelerator series. So we're going to be diving into some of those topics today. My name's Justin Bock. I've been working in nonprofit industry for about 15 years across nonprofits of all different sizes. So just like you, Steve, I've worked at Habitat for Humanity. I've worked at CASA. I've worked at free health clinics all over the place. Now I'm bringing that expertise as a consultant and partnering with City Connections to get some of this information out and build capacity at these nonprofits and build capacity in these projects for community impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I'm Steve Bernacchi. I'm the Executive Director of City Connections here. We connect the church and the city by mobilizing volunteers and really just getting people out in the community doing good things. Again, as Buck said, I've been in the nonprofit world for over 20 years with Habitat for Humanity, with the United States Golf Association, the PGA of America. Been all over the country, seen all kinds of fun stuff. And as Buck and I started, talking about this, we know that we have a lot of knowledge that we can pass forward through you. And this whole series is going to be about not just Buck and I, but bringing folks in from the nonprofit world to really make an impact in your nonprofit.
Right. Yeah. And, Steve, as you and I were talking about what kind of things we could do to help newer nonprofits or launching nonprofits and even well-established nonprofits, we were talking about the staggering number of nonprofits that exist just in Arkansas. So what is it, like 14?
Yeah, you're sitting at like 14,500 nonprofits. That doesn't count the churches as well. So you're upwards of 18,000 groups that are out there trying to help each other, but a lot of times maybe don't have the tools to really be impactful and grow their capacity.
So that's the problem that we're kind of attacking here with the Quarry programming. When you look at the figures, most nonprofits, when they start up that first year, a third of them don't even make it out of the first year of their existence. They shut all the way down. By the second or by the year 3, another third of them has dropped off. And then look at by year 5, you really only have about 16% of nonprofits in that top area that are succeeding. So some of those nonprofits still exist, but are they producing programming? Some of those nonprofits just aren't really operating, even though they're still in existence.
Well, over my shoulder, Babe Ruth, if he had hit 160 the first 5 years of his career, he wouldn't be Babe Ruth. And so right now we're really not hitting a good average, and just want to really make sure that those nonprofits have the tools they need.
Absolutely. So that has led us to create the Quarry at City Connections. And you can kind of see on this slide some of the different divisions of activities we're going to be doing. Today, we're launching that top bullet point, that Collaborative Impact Accelerator, with our first course on logic models. We also have a nonprofit growth incubator. Steve, will you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so right now we have 12 partners that house in here with us at City Connections. They get office space, they get a mailing address, which is super important for nonprofits to have that air of professionality. They've got access to our printers. They've also got access to all of the wealth of knowledge that myself and my staff bring, and Justin that you bring, but that collaboration of coming together with ideas and really understanding the power of one versus the power of a fist, and being able to collaborate and make that huge impact is what that incubator is all about.
Yeah, there's an old proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And that kind of hammers home the impact of that collaboration piece. And even when we're kind of just connected digitally in the era that we're in right now, those connections are really powerful. I've been seeing a lot of partner organizations that are already officing with City Connections, communicating with one another, sharing some contact information, and working together to get through a difficult time. But gosh, when we're all in the office together, when we're healthy and ready to connect like that, it is amazing to see what kind of collaborative projects happen.
Well, and that's the fun part, I think, as we talk about that going into the next bullet point with that Community Leadership Academy. it's great watching these folks talk to each other, and for lack of a better term, you see the leaders start to come to the forefold, and you see the people
Yep.
who want to do more. And so we'll be offering workshops and boot camps throughout the entire year. Skill focused training for individuals. I just had one of our friends, Jay Buck, that you and I know, was furloughed, and she was asking, what do you have going on? And she really wants to focus on some event planning and things of that nature, where we can really dig in on her on that aspect. And then again, that custom training solution for different organizations. I know that you and I, through Buck Consulting and City Connections, have worked with the Conway Ministry Center and Centers for Youth and Families and Home Away from Home, and it's really about finding out their story, their passion, and then focusing a real solution to their problems.
Right. Yeah. And so to break those 3 program areas down, our Collaborative Impact Accelerator is going to focus on project ideas for community impact. So we're focused on projects there. Our Nonprofit Growth Incubator is focused on nonprofit organizations who could benefit from that collaborative experience, who might be going through a period of transition, who might be a newer nonprofit and need some growth resources. And our Community Leadership Academy focuses on individuals who want to skill up, who maybe want to switch industries, or who need to build a skill set in their board of directors, their volunteer corps, things like that. So that's a great way to think about those, is we're impacting projects, nonprofits, and individuals with this programming.
Yep, perfect.
So like we said, we're launching out our Collaborative Impact Accelerator today. We're very excited about this. It's gonna kind of turn into 6 to 9 months of curriculum-based programming. So we've designed this curriculum to teach folks what they need to do to get a project off the ground, whether that's starting a new nonprofit or collaborating with an existing nonprofit. We're gonna teach you the skills that you need to make it successful and get it executed.
Yep.
So we'll do one of these sessions each month. Our original hope was that we could do this in person and be very, very collaborative in nature. With our new reality that who knows how long this digital experience is going to last, we are prepared to offer these as small group online trainings. So we will still have that once a month training experience that's engaging, that's collaborative, that's done in a small group setting to get you the most you can. The Collaborative Impact Accelerator, one of the huge benefits here is up to 4 months, 4 hours each month of one-to-one coaching.
Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah, as a nonprofit, somebody who spent a long time in nonprofits, I can't tell you how much I would have experienced as my, in my first 6 months as a brand new executive director for some coaching like that. It would have made a huge difference in my learning curve and my growth curve, or even my first director development job. It would have been huge to have that coaching. So as folks are moving through this and developing their projects, they'll have up to 4 hours each month, one-to-one coaching, working on their project.
Well, and what I really like about what we've put together here too is that next bullet point is it's not just sitting in a room listening to people drone on. We're actually going to create these project-based hands-on learning. I mean, we're not going to have a class and say, take care, guys. You're going to have homework. You're going to have things that you're going to be working on, so that by the end of this 6 to 9 month period, you're going to actually be doing it. You're going to have something tangible that you can wrap your arms around. So I'm super excited about that.
Yeah, that's what we really want to focus on, is these, very clear outcomes for these projects. So to give you an example, let's say you're an individual in the community who's volunteered with a lot of nonprofits, who maybe works in the private sector but wants to make an impact. And you say, man, I've got this great idea for how we could make a difference to this population or this group of folks who's dealing with this issue in our community. So you could bring that idea to our Collaborative Impact Accelerator, and we will flesh it all the way out with a clear desired outcome. Or on the other end of that, let's say you are a small to medium-sized nonprofit or even a large nonprofit who's looking at launching a new program.
Bingo.
So you could send that program manager or whoever is taking the lead on that program or project and flesh it all the way out so that that program is starting with a firm foundation and we know that it's set up for success.
Sure.
Like I said, each of these has a clear desired outcome. You're either going to find an existing nonprofit or work for an existing nonprofit and create a memorandum of understanding to house that project or program, or you're going to start a new nonprofit if you
Sure.
just absolutely cannot find a partner, or produce an in-depth case study on that community problem so we can put it in our community impact library.
Well, and you've heard me say it a million times, Jay Buck, you know, with the 14,000 plus nonprofits, the last thing we need is somebody to start a nonprofit for three-legged puppies with eye patches.
Yeah.
We just don't need that. Now, if you bring that to us, we can do that in-depth case study, but we're really trying to flush out ideas and make sure that when people are coming to us with whatever it is, that they know by the end of this where they stand, and they can talk it out amongst themselves, so to speak. So we were talking, you know, and I know that you run your own consulting firm, and I know that people's time and energy, you know, there's a cost to that. And, you know, when we came up with this number, this $300 investment, I said, well, gee, J-Buck, is that a good deal or not? I don't even know. How did you, I mean, explain that $4,500 value to people really quick, 60 seconds.
Yeah, when we're looking at that $300 investment, you're looking at 6 to 9 months of programming, which is huge. These are going to be 60 to 90-minute courses that would be very expensive if you purchase them online or from a consultant. That 4 hours per month, one-to-one coaching, that's $125 or more per hour value. So that's a huge value to you or your project or your organization. And when you're talking about this curriculum that we've been designing and working through, and the access to expert opinions and expert takes on these different aspects of your project or program, the value of this is well over $4,500. You know, if you were to try to access these resources in some other way outside of the City Connections program, it would be much more expensive. There's a couple of reasons we're able to do that. Number one, we want to keep this accessible for people with great ideas to make a difference. And number two, we have some partners like the Fruoff Foundation who have helped to subsidize our programming so that we can produce this at an accessible cost.
Absolutely. No, and I'm glad you brought the Fruoffs up. They're amazing people and believe in what we're doing, because they've always had a small incubator in their office as well. And so they see small nonprofits struggle and grind. And so just super, super excited about this. And, you know, we'll talk about the capstone presentations and the grant support, I think, here in the next slide, as far as what the breakdown looks like. There we go. Maybe.
All right.
There we go.
Yep. So our overview of training topics. Through this programming, we are going to be talking about a lot of different aspects of your project or program to get it off the ground. So we're going to start today with logic models and theories of change. We're going to get
favorite thing in the world, by the way.
Yes. What we're going to do, and what I'm excited actually about this co-presenting with Steve on today's topic is, you know, logic models and theories of change are a very academic topic. I mean, it's a little brain heavy when you think about, well, I just want to get out in the field and make a difference. But you know, we're going to break this down and take a very academic topic and make it applicable to your real world experiences. We're going to bring our street learning into the conversation to kind of apply this and make this applicable for you and your problem or project. We're also going to cover collaboration and coalitions to solve community problems.
And these are future classes, correct?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So after today, you know, these are our monthly classes.
Right.
So I mentioned over the next 6 months, we're going to be covering these specific topics. And, you know, Steve, you were just talking about, hey, the last thing we want in the world is to start a new nonprofit that has such a narrow focus that it's not able to make a big difference. So as we talk about collaboration and coalitions to solve community problems, we're going to talk about how do you build good partnerships and how do you work together with other organizations to make the biggest dent in the universe that you can.
Yep.
And then we're going to talk about maximizing volunteers and community resources. We're going to talk about funding your work into the future. That's the hot topic, right? That's what everybody wants to learn.
Especially
is how
right
do we
now.
fund this? Yeah.
How do I find the money, Steve? How do I find the
Exactly.
money?
But we definitely want to build this foundation to say, hey, it's not just about going out and grabbing $1,000 to feed, popcorn to dolphins at SeaWorld. I mean,
Ooh,
it's
that's a
about,
new one. I like that.
there we go. It's about firm foundations and making a meaningful difference in the community.
Yeah.
And then we're going to talk about how do you communicate your vision to stakeholders in the community? I mean, how do you get the message out in a way that brings people together around this cause?
Mm-hmm.
And then we're going to talk about one of the most important topics, which is leadership and ethics in the nonprofit world.
So I'll be teaching that one. J-Buck won't.
Yeah. But as you talk about leadership and ethics, when you move into the nonprofit sector, there's a lot of public trust. I mean, you're dealing with donated funds. You have a special designation from the federal government. You may be seeking federal or state grants. So there's a lot of public trust involved. We want to make sure that, hey, if you're thinking about bringing a project into, existence in the nonprofit sector, or if you're thinking about leaping into the nonprofit world, we want to give you a firm foundation and a clear picture of what it looks like on the leadership and ethics end. And then something we're really excited about, we are at the end of this going to have a pitch competition for all of these projects to come out, all of our cohort members to put together, what Steve was talking about, those monthly deliverable homework items into a comprehensive pitch, and to pitch that to some of our nonprofit leadership partners, some of our foundation partners, some of our funding partners, to give everybody a good look of what you've been working on and see, hey, can we partner to make this problem a little less of a problem? Can we partner to bring this solution to market, so to speak?
Yeah.
Or can we partner, hey, to fund a new initiative?
Absolutely.
Or, can you help me with some insight on this problem that I've been working on?
Mm-hmm. No, I'm excited about that piece. We've been talking to a lot of our banking partners and funding partners and grant that's just going to be so much fun. I as we talk about logic models, what I love about you and I, how we've always worked together, is I think you're one of the smartest dudes I know. You look at things very academically, and I'm just like, oh, let's get to the pitch. Let's go. And so, but that's where we work so well together. So it's going to be a fun year for sure.
Absolutely. So our Collaborative Impact Accelerator program curriculum. So we just talked about those training courses we're going to be offering. Here's what we're really trying to get done with this Collaborative Impact Accelerator and what you can expect if you sign up to be part of our cohort. We're going to focus on producing this program logic model. And as you're going to come to understand over this training, that program logic model is your roadmap for making a difference. It is your absolutely indispensable tool to make the biggest difference you can. We're going to focus on monthly deliverable planning documents, things like this program logic model, like a volunteer and leadership plan, like a services survey, and a funding plan, a marketing plan. We're going to help you create these deliverable documents that'll lead to that cohesive, comprehensive pitch piece.
Right.
We're going to be doing these monthly in-person or small group online classes. We're going to present expert topical presentations. We're going to have opportunities for networking with experts in the field and with funding partners. And we're going to allow hands-on work periods, whether we're online or in person, to get these deliverable documents done. So if you're somebody who's saying, well, wait a minute, I work a full-time job, or, well, wait a minute, I work a full-time and a part-time job, and I've got a side hustle, but I want to get this done. We are going to create the space that you need to be successful in this program and get you that one-to-one consulting, coaching help that you need to get it all ready to present. So you're not in this alone.
Well, and again, I think it's important to note, you're not just going to see mine and J-Buck's faces nonstop. Granted, we're doing this online to launch, but we're hoping the world changes again and we can actually bring these things together one-on-one. But we've already lined up a ton of executive directors and business professionals and people to come in and speak to you from real perspectives, real in the trenches stuff. So yeah, it's going to be it's going to be an ability for you to also grow your network in a way that you couldn't even imagine.
Yep, absolutely. And of course, you're going to have those weekly check-ins with a nonprofit coach. Here's spoiler alert, that's me. I'm dedicated to your success. I'm dedicated to the success of this program. And I'm going to be checking in with you and saying, you know, hey, not only for accountability, saying, how are we coming on that funding plan, but to say, hey, how are we coming on that funding plan? Let's take a look at it together. And, you know, I've been raising money for over a decade. So
Right.
maybe I can give you some input, ideas, and insight into how this might work.
Sometimes even insight on what not to do.
Absolutely. Oh, that's most of what I have for you.
Well, cool. Well, in just a second, we'll jump on to the next piece of logic models. All right. So, J-Buck, you know, this is you and I. It's always funny because I think I do this naturally, but it's not something I necessarily like to talk about. So can you break logic models down simply?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing about logic models, because I mentioned already, it can feel like a really academic, brain heavy topic for people who like to be more hands-on and direct impact. Logic models are great for nonprofits. They're very important because they promote clarity and keep organizations on mission. They clearly communicate your impact for partners and funders. Mm-hmm. They identify gaps in services and resources, and they guide your intentional planning and growth. So these logic models that we're going to take a look at today, I described them earlier as your roadmap for success, and they absolutely are. I did not realize the importance of logic models until late in my career, which has been frankly pretty recently, and the power of those, especially as I was writing federal grants, for example, or as I'm writing, you know, very big foundation grants, or as we're trying to align programs with strategic plans that just don't make a lot of sense. We can map those out on a logic model and see where's the problem here and how can we work a little bit better. And I love this Eisenhower quote, you know, below. I feel like, Steve, this is how you and I work a lot. And a lot of nonprofit professionals work this way a lot. You know, in preparing for battle, I've always found plans are useless, but planning is indispensable.
Have you ever run an event that has gone exactly to spec and exactly followed the calendar and exactly?
Never in my life.
Not even close. I mean, and whether it's a volunteer event, whether it's a fundraiser, whether it's the Quarry. We were going to have everybody in here in the office. Things don't always go the way you want, but as long as you have that plan, your adjustments are smaller and more well thought out. So
absolutely. So what is a logic model then? So this is who knows? This is a very basic chart that breaks down a logic model, and you can see here that I'm gonna put some little marks here. You can see that it's divided into two pieces at the very top level. Okay, we've got the process, we've got the outcomes. Okay, so we're going to be producing these outcomes. We're going to be producing these outcomes by following this process that we put together. Then we've got it broken then down even further into what does that process look like. So we've got a good look at your inputs. These are your project resources. You can see some more information down here below here, what specifically those are. Your core project components, right? So your inputs are, what are we investing in this project? Then we're moving to activities. With those inputs, what are we actually doing as a nonprofit? You know, is it a reading program? Are we doing tutoring? We'll dive into all of that here in just a little bit.
Yeah.
Then you've got your outputs. So this is still in the process piece here. Your outputs are the data points that show they're evidence that you're implementing this project. So a good output that we'll talk about here in just a little bit, you know, if I said, hey, our activity is a reading program, okay, well then how many reading sessions did you do and how many students went through that reading program?
So this is data driven is what you're saying on that.
That's exactly right. And you can see at the bottom there, I put, you know, this might be number of clients served, number of interventions, number of referrals, numbers.
Yep.
Your outputs are usually very quantifiable data that you're using to say, hey, yes, we actually are doing these activities, because you can tell because this many people came through this many classes in this period of time.
Gotcha.
And then we're moving over to these outcomes, right? This is what we all want to produce, are good outcomes to show some evidence of change.
Mm-hmm.
So today we're going to break those down into short-term, medium-term, and long-term outcomes. And you can see that those outcomes largely vary in what kind of changes we're trying to see. These are usually qualitative changes. So these are usually influenced by data, but there are things that we're seeing, hey, is this person's knowledge, skills, and or attitudes, is that changing?
So this is kind of the Superman 10,000 foot view.
Yep.
And so, like, you and I talk about it all the time. I like that 10,000, 30,000 foot view. I like to paint the big picture, and then we'll figure out the details as we go. Or you've heard me say, hey guys, we're going to the mountaintop. Well, Steve, what about the river and the forest? Don't worry about that. Let's know where we're going.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and that's absolutely right. And, really that 30,000 foot view is right here in the long term, where we're seeing a change in life condition.
Mm-hmm.
But before we get there, we've got to see changes in people's behavior and actions, right? We've got to see changes in knowledge, skills, and or attitudes. And when we're talking about these kind of changes, it's tempting to just think of individuals. And in fact, I've been communicating it as we need to see change in this person's behavior. This can be behavior or actions, knowledge, skills, attitudes in, if you're doing policy work, it could be those changes seen in your local community or in a legislative body or things of that nature. Or, for animals, okay, well then what big picture change are we trying to create? And what behavior or action in our community needs to change? What knowledge, skills, and or attitudes need to be built here to be successful?
And you've heard me say it a lot, and it's been kind of a buzzword probably for the past decade, but that culture change.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm a big culture change guy, culture change. And so again, in as much as I never got to go through stuff like this, I intrinsically, whether it was through, the people that I worked for and everything else, they had laid these things out in such a beautiful, positive way that I just instinctively go through these processes. But we're going to teach everybody all this fun stuff. So.
Absolutely. So digging into this in a little more detail, here we've got logic models and theories of change, right? So we talked a little bit about the logic model already. So what in the world is a theory of change? Well, it turns out they're very, very similar. And so some people I just want to pause here and say, some people may say, this is different from what I've learned or what I teach or what I do. That's fine. What we're trying to do today is establish what very basically is a logic model and how have we used them in our real world nonprofit practice to make a difference. And so some of this is going to be that academic information that's tinged with real world experience. This logic model and theory of change, they're academic ideas that are like adjacent or parallel. But I kind of translate logic models into theories of change by saying, if our logic model is our roadmap, then our theory of change is our storyboard.
Gotcha.
So you can kind of see how that works there. If we have these inputs and use them to execute these activities, we'll see these quantifiable outputs, which lead to these short-term outcomes, these medium-term, and finally down here to that long-term life change that we can see in our clients or in our target population.
Well, and again, J-Buck, I love this. I remember when we were at the 501c3 conference a couple of years ago, one of the breakout sessions was on logic models and theories of change. And I walked out having no idea what I had just listened to.
Yeah.
and that's okay. And it takes some time, but again, that's why we're trying to think, to your point, parallel these. So no matter how you've heard this story, what you've seen, this will hopefully make some sense to you in focusing your energies for your nonprofit or your idea.
Right. Absolutely. And like I said, to help you take that very technical piece, or what some people may think is a technical piece of a logic model, and break it into a narrative format so that you can do some
Absolutely.
storytelling with, hey, like this is the hero story that we're trying to create, right?
Dude, I
With that.
tell you all the time, talk to me like I'm 3. This is perfect.
Yep. All right. So we're going to be focusing mainly on logic modeling. So there are 2 different ways that you can logic model, and I'm going to describe those to you briefly, and then tell you why we're going to be using the model that we're using. So the first way to do it, and I recommend using forward logic modeling, if you have an existing program that you are trying to evaluate, or trying to find, well, what is the missing link that we're not producing these outputs or outcomes? But this is if-then logic modeling. It's forward logic modeling. So you're saying, if we have these inputs, then we can carry out these activities. And then if we do these activities, then we will produce these outputs. So it's if then, if then, if then. And you can really easily tell where there's a broken link in that chain if you're honest with yourself and you're putting in, hey, how much money are we investing in this program? Are we paying our staff well enough, or to attract staff with the expertise that we need? Do we have the right staff in the right places? Do we have the right volunteers? And if we don't, well, maybe that's why we're not executing these activities.
Sure.
And if we're not executing those activities well, maybe that's why we're not producing this data.
Sure.
And then, so that starts with inputs and runs down to long-term outcomes.
In other words, if I plant this seed, will it become a tree?
That's exactly right. And so what the model that we're going to be using is called backward logic modeling. Because when you're talking about a brand new program, I think it's always best to start with that 30,000 foot view. What is the big picture? What's the dream outcome for this program? And then how are we going to produce that? So if that long-term outcome, we'll look at some examples here in just a bit, but if that long-term outcome is your big dream, okay, well then what little outcomes do we need to see in the meantime? And then how many people or how many programs will we be impacting? What will we do to produce that impact? Okay, what will we need to produce those activities? So we're going to be talking a little more about backward logic modeling today than we will forward logic modeling. But again, I want to draw the distinction. I recommend using forward logic modeling if you're assessing an existing program, and backward logic modeling if you're launching a brand new program.
Perfect. Well, and that's, that makes a lot of sense. People say, Steve, you're all backwards. Well, maybe that's because I'm doing the backward logic modeling.
A dreamer.
So, yeah, I'm a big time dreamer. So, all right. And just a second here, we're going to jump on to the next slide.
Yes.
Okay. So, we talk about me being a little bit backward, and me, I'm always wanting to make a huge impact, whether it's through my networking groups, whether it's through city connections, my home church, my marriage, whatever it is. I'm always looking to do big, bold, great things. I don't know that sometimes I accomplish them because I'm doing those big dreams and not breaking it down to its base. So maybe you can walk us through a little bit of this.
Absolutely. So in that backward logic model, or in that outcome first logic model, you're starting with that long-term outcome. So remember, this is the big idea. This is the big impact, the bold life change that we're hoping to see with our clients, or the people or policies or structures that we're wanting to impact. So we're going to start with those long-term outcomes. We start with the end in sight. So, I mentioned this is a roadmap to your impact. When you used to sit down and plan a trip, with mom, dad, or the whole family, you'd lay the old Rand McNally out on the table, and you would say, where are we going? And then you'd map your way there. That's how we're going to treat this long-term outcome.
But to that point, if you don't know what your destination is, there's no way to map it any direction. So,
that's right. Yeah. And that's actually an important point, because, when you talk about staying focused on what you're trying to get done, if you're not laser focused on this long-term outcome, then you could be distracted away from achieving the change that you set out to achieve. And that happens all the time in nonprofits, whether it's chasing funding or chasing brand new practices or chasing innovation. All of those things are good. Funding, innovation, and brand new practices are great, but we want to stay laser focused on the impact that we're trying to create so that we're not distracted away from it.
Gotcha.
So we want to ask questions like, what life change are we trying to produce? And what does the problem solve look like? So if we start by saying, man, this problem exists in our community, and a problem that we'll take a look at here in just a second is, hey, are foster children successfully transitioning to independent living?
Right.
The answer in most states is absolutely not.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're looking at that problem, there's a real easy way to say, well, what does that problem solve look like? Well, if the problem is foster children are not successfully transitioning to independent living, all we have to do is reverse that and say foster children are successfully transitioning to independent living. So that's one really simple way to take a look at, well, what long-term outcome do I need to be looking at? Just state your problem and then flip it and say, instead of not, well, they are. And so then we can take that big idea and break it down into its outcome components and then back into the process that we need to get there.
Gotcha.
So like I mentioned, a problem solved, children will successfully transition from foster care to independent living, or students will achieve their educational goals.
Sure.
These are they tend to be broad statements about the situation or the life situation of individuals or clients that we want to work with. Those medium-term outcomes are changes in behavior and actions that it's going to take to get there. We'll take a look at that in just a second. Short-term outcomes are changes in knowledge, skills, and then you can either read that as attitudes or abilities.
Right.
Sometimes if you're talking about needing to influence your community's attitudes around foster children, or your community's, a great example is your community's attitudes around breed-specific legislation with pit bull terriers or other breed dogs. You can kind of switch out that abilities and attitudes.
Well, and honestly, that's kind of what we are focusing on a little bit, is getting people the knowledge and the skills. And so kind of that intermediary, because to your point, I think many times we might have the beginning ready to go and we might have the end ready to go, and somewhere in the middle everything kind of explodes on you and you're like, where am I going? I don't know, I'm lost. So growing in knowledge, growing in skills, growing in abilities is what we're here for.
Yep. And that last bullet there, that this kind of lays out as we're backing into this thing. So in order to create this change in that life station or situation, what behavior or actions need to change?
Right.
And then the next question would be, well, what changes in knowledge, skills, and abilities will be necessary to create those shifts in behavior or actions? Right. So you can't exactly say, it would be really easy to say we're going to take a problem where most low-income families are not, they have no savings, and a lot of them are not using banking institutions in the first place. It would be real easy to say, okay, well, the behavior that needs to change is they just need to go down and open a bank account. Well, there's easy. Well, there you go, problem solved. But we have to build knowledge, skills, and attitudes in those folks, or knowledge, skills, and abilities to know that we can trust these banking institutions with our hard-earned money. Absolutely. We have to build abilities to know, well, how do you pick the best bank for your needs? Or if you're going to get a credit card, how do you compare these? We have to build the knowledge, skills, and abilities before we can just expect people to be successful in going out and changing behaviors.
Absolutely.
So we're going to look at how to determine these outcomes, because this can be a little bit of a challenge sometimes, is knowing how to get from one step to the next. So we're going to take that problem statement that I talked about earlier. Foster children are not successfully transitioning from foster care to supported or independent living. An important note here is to say that for a lot of these big problems that are facing our communities, of course, that's not the case for every single foster child. I mean, I know a lot of folks who have transitioned very successfully from foster care to independent living. But if you look at the data, which you should do before you start attacking this problem, if you look at the data and realize that a majority of these children are not making successful transitions, or there's a persistent pattern in the data that says that these children, whether it's in a geographic location or whether it's a life circumstance, these children are having a hard time transitioning. So just an important point on, before you go out and say, the problem that we want to solve is that the moon is too far from the earth. We're thinking about the
Yeah.
data, we're thinking about achievable goals. But when we get to that problem statement that we really want to work on, all I've done here is flip that. Foster children not successfully transitioning from foster care to supported or independent living, to our long-term outcome, children will successfully transition from foster care to independent living.
And what I love about that, and you know me, J Buck, and again, I'll say it one more time on this webinar.
Mm-hmm.
I say it all the time. Okay, talk to me like I'm three. Like, let's
Mm-hmm.
not convolute the issue. What are you really trying to accomplish? We're
Right.
trying to get children to successfully transition. Awesome.
Yep.
That's a great goal. That's something we can work with and back into. How do we get there?
Exactly. Yeah. So breaking that long-term outcome, that big piece, right?
Yeah.
That simple statement of a complex problem. So then we have to think about, okay, well, in this situation, what does independent living look like, and what behaviors will it take to achieve? So I've linked here. If we're talking about behaviors or actions that people are taking, those are medium-term outcomes.
Yeah.
So if we're talking about successfully transitioning, so talking about a life station change to independent living,
Yeah.
the next question is, what behaviors are we going to try to influence?
Well, yeah,
So
because if you send a kid into an apartment and they don't know how to write a budget or how to pay a
right,
light bill, we're not helping them.
exactly. Yeah. So as we're thinking about these medium-term outcomes, okay, we've got our long-term outcome. Now, what do our medium-term outcomes need to be?
Sure.
When you're writing medium-term outcomes for any cause, I really encourage you, use action verbs. A lot of people struggle with what we call passive voice. We're not using helping verbs like, students will be able to, no, we're going to use strong action verbs. So if I'm talking about the specific problems of foster children who are trying to successfully transition, I'm thinking about educational attainment. So I'm using action verbs and action words like students will finish their schooling, students will attain higher education. If I'm thinking about employment, I'm saying students will get and hold a job.
Yeah.
Students will secure better employment. If I'm thinking about stable housing, students will rent a house, or foster children will transition to renting a house or apartment.
Right.
So we're thinking about these action verbs because these are actions that these clients need to be able to take to tell that we've made a medium-term or achieved a medium-term outcome.
Well, and I love the next bullet point too, because again, you've heard me say it a million times, J-Buck, how do you eat an elephant?
Mm-hmm.
One bite
One bite
at
at
a
a time.
We're not going to be able to do all of these things at once, but if we, set out a goal, whether it's again for these students, whether it's for an animal shelter, whether it's for City Connections trying to contact all the churches in Central Arkansas, that doesn't just happen all at once. It's you got to have those goals for those outcomes.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So setting those scalable goals for outcomes, it's important for a couple of reasons. Number one, you'll know that you're getting there when you achieve the small goals, and you're building up to these things. So number one, it's a great way to know that you're making meaningful progress. Number two, it's a great way to not just throw it all in the garbage and go back to
Absolutely
back to making bacon or something. It's a great way to keep yourself and your stakeholders engaged and encouraged as you're seeing these scalable goals, be achieved and these outcomes start to build around each other.
Baby steps.
Yeah. So some of those, I mean, you can break those action verbs, you can break those medium-term outcomes down even further to, hey, if one of your medium-term outcomes that this person who's transitioning to independent living will get and hold a job. Okay, well, before you get and hold a job, you got to go make applications for jobs. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
maybe one of our medium-term outcomes is this person is applying for jobs or
No,
something of
absolutely,
that
yeah.
nature. So that's how we go from long-term to medium-term goals. We're taking the
Cool.
big idea, breaking it down into the actions that they need to get to that life change. So then the next question is, well, then how do you get from medium-term to short-term outcomes? So
Hmm.
how do you take those actions and behaviors that need to change and build into them with those knowledge, skills, and or abilities that they need? So I've created kind of a medium-term outcome statement up top. In order for young people to successfully transition to independent living,
I
there's
get
their
it.
long-term outcome.
Yeah.
They will need to attain educational goals, become fully employed, and secure stable housing.
Got
So
it.
there are my 3 medium-term outcomes
That's
right there
awesome.
in
Yeah.
one statement.
It's pretty
So
simple, really.
now, oh yeah, well, we're it is really simple when you break it down like that.
Right.
And I'm glad you mentioned that because it actually can take quite a bit of work to get to
Sure.
that really simple statement. But you see already how doing some of these logic model exercises make this very easy to communicate to stakeholders.
Yeah.
That sentence there makes sense. And there's
Yeah.
probably a lot of research that goes into what are those medium-term outcomes.
Yeah. Yeah.
But, people don't want to have to do that. They want to hear you, the expert on this issue, tell
Right.
them what needs to happen.
Right.
So your next question to ask yourself or your team as you're thinking about this is, what knowledge, skills, and or abilities do young people need to make these goals? That should sound familiar.
Yeah.
Those are short-term outcomes.
Absolutely.
So
That's awesome.
we're gonna break down these short-term outcomes. What do we need to achieve by the specific medium-term outcome goals? So
I
now that we
gotcha.
have these 3 medium-term outcome goals, this attain educational goals, become fully employed, secure stable housing, we can break down short-term outcomes according to that. So in other
That's
words,
awesome.
you can
This is
ask,
like mental Legos. I love it. This is
yeah.
so simple, really.
We're building a Star Destroyer here, one Lego at a time. Yeah.
Exactly. I love it.
So to take a look at this here, I just want to point out, if I can figure it out, there it is. I want to point out that you're linking, okay, short-term, medium-term outcomes of finish schooling and attain higher education
Right.
with, okay, here are some short-term, or we're asking this question about each of those. So
Sure.
in order to do that, what knowledge, skills, and or abilities do we need to build? Well, we need to build study skills. We
Right.
need to build academic success skills. We need to build college entry navigation skills and college career connection skills.
I dig it.
So we're thinking in each of these areas, okay, what are some ways to help them get to that goal? So remember when I said set some scalable
Yeah.
goals,
Yeah.
that's where your short-term outcomes can come in, because we're building the knowledge, skills, and abilities that these students need to do it themselves.
Perfect.
Because when it comes to those action points, folks, we can help people do all kinds of things. Okay, we can
Right.
help them get into stable housing. We can get into stable employment, but you can't hold everybody's hand and walk them into that apartment office.
Right.
So we are building the knowledge, skills, and abilities that they need to achieve those goals for themselves. And then we're linking these employment goals. We're asking, again, the question that comes up each time: in order for them to reach full employment goals, to get a job and secure better employment, what knowledge, skills, or abilities do these young people need to meet those goals?
Yeah.
So if you think about job search skills, interviewing strategies, some resume preparation, some teamwork and soft skills, some job training and placement, these are things that are going to lead to that. And
Well, yeah, and what I love about this too, Jayba, because I know that you and I have had conversations with a number of the nonprofits here at City
mhm,
Connections, and it's actually, this is really cool for me to watch because I watch you do this all the time.
right.
But to really see it on paper and go, oh, I get this. I get how the funnel is working now,
Yeah,
and what this is all about. I mean, it is logical. Hence
absolutely.
logic models. I mean, go figure. Yeah, this
Yeah,
is cool.
imagine that.
Yeah.
So then, on our last medium term goal that we set there together, stable housing goals. You rent. What do you need to know to rent a house or apartment?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's hard to think about what folks will need, what knowledge, skills, or abilities people need to acquire, because we may already, as we're thinking about it, we're already in that situation.
Yeah. I'm going to
We
go
already
apply.
have.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've had 6 jobs in the past 2 years. No, I'm kidding. But if you already have a job and you haven't had to go look for one in a long time,
Right.
you might not know, or you might not remember what that was like. If you're on year 6 of your mortgage, you may not remember what it was like to go look for or rent an apartment.
Yeah.
So that goes to a point that I want to make here, which is, as you think about these things, don't do it in a vacuum. Do it with some input from some folks. Join up with a program like the Quarry and run this through a group of folks who have different experiences than you. I also always encourage people to include somebody that's in this life situation that you're trying to impact.
That's huge.
In those
Yes.
conversations.
1,000%. I mean, you remember our days at Habitat. We didn't go into a neighborhood and just start building and doing things. We went into the neighborhood and found out what they needed and what they wanted, and how the neighborhood could be best impacted, but from them.
Exactly. Yeah. So we can include those folks, but I just thinking about very basic, some things you can do on your own as you're planning this is think about very basic skills that would lead you to be successful in renting a house or apartment. So how do we teach folks to be a good tenant and know their rights and responsibilities as a tenant? How do we teach folks to do budgeting and learn more about their financial situation? And how do we make sure that people have stable and reliable transportation, from their apartment to work? If we're wanting them to do that, to school, if we're wanting them to do that, how do we teach them how to do that?
Sure.
And then, a thing that I put just kind of almost miscellaneously that doesn't really fit into one of those specific ones, but that really fits into each one is, let's think now, let's take a step back from our medium-term outcomes and say, is there any common thread here that could really help people in this situation? So in this specific example, I've put, how do we educate folks about their foster, if you're graduating or if you're aging out of the foster care system, what are your rights and benefits and what state-sponsored supports are available?
Well, and again, I love this example because it sounds like we're going to start a new nonprofit, but it's very similar in veteran services. How do the veterans know their rights and benefits? Do they know how to get their support? Disabled folks, low to moderate income folks, whatever it may be. And so I love that you added that bullet point, because there's a lot of other support out there that we need to think about.
Well, and again, as I was trying to think about how can I present this as an example to folks so that we're making this a real world situation, I really did. I focused in deep on education and employment and housing, and I went, okay, cool, we're done. But then I had to remind myself, wait a minute, let's take a step back, look at what we've got here and what medium-term outcomes, and is there any common thread? And that's when it came out, and I was like, well, in each of those instances, there are actually some state-sponsored supports available for folks. And frankly, I know that because I spent quite a lot of time working on foster care issues and things of that nature.
Like CASA.
But even if you didn't, if you take a step back and go, wow, these young people are transitioning from foster care and they're trying to finish their education or attain higher education. They're trying to get employed. They're trying to get into stable housing without the benefit of a stable family that they've come from. Should there be something else? There's nothing wrong with saying nothing exists right now and it's a problem. And should there be some state-sponsored support? So how can we work in this situation about building knowledge, skills, and or abilities, or that other word, attitudes, with our decision makers in these realms to help young people, in this case, transition from foster care more successfully?
Cool.
So let's see, we're moving on now. So how do we take those outcomes and make them make a little more sense in the context of our broader logic model? So I've just kind of created like a catalog of those outcomes that we've been talking about here as an example. Our long-term outcome, children will successfully transition from foster care to independent living. How are we going to do that? We're going to help them finish schooling and or attain higher education, attain full employment, and secure stable housing.
So this just took everything we talked about and puts it in a nice little package. So
that's exactly right. Yeah. So here's our, like I said, here's our long-term, our short-term, our medium-term, and our short-term.
Awesome.
And it's just cataloged for you. And so, and I highly recommend that. You know, sometimes it's helpful for me, and we'll do an exercise in a little bit. It's helpful for me sometimes to write each of these on an individual Post-it note or sticky note and map it out and say, well, where does that really fit? And how does that really look? And how can I categorize these things? It's very helpful for me to do that. So
well, and I like this too, because it's like, okay, if I'm about to start this nonprofit, or if I'm gonna begin a task, I can ask myself, okay, does this help them attain study and academic success? Does this help them navigate? And you can go through it. And if it's something that we call it mission creep, if it's something that's not in our short, medium, or long-term goals, we might not need to be doing it. It may be distracting us from where we need to be here. And so I love this.
And sometimes, you know, I'm glad you brought up mission creep, because sometimes those things, they sound like they make sense, right? It's like, okay, well, you know, oh, one of my volunteers came to me and said, well, shouldn't we be helping, you know, if they're moving into apartments, shouldn't we be helping them by maybe stocking their pantry? And you say, oh, that's a great idea. You know, they don't know maybe how to grocery shop. And so, okay, maybe that's a life skill we need to teach them, but let's stock their pantry too. And then before you know it, you like blink and you've got a storage unit full of canned goods and you're running a food pantry. And it's like, that's not what we do here, you know?
Right.
These, you know, very, very clearly articulating these will help you to keep that laser focus and that mission.
That's awesome.
And keep you from mission creep. Because like I said, it's really, really tempting sometimes to take those great ideas and say, no, yeah, that does feed into what we're doing. But if you have these logic model and these outcomes and these goals set like this, you can take a look at it and go, ooh, we don't actually do that. But if that's a need, let's find a partner.
Let's find a partner. Exactly. Yeah. Cool, man.
So you can see, I just kind of took that 1, 2, 3 and fit it back into our logic model here.
Perfect.
You know, so as you're drafting your logic model, you know, it doesn't have to look like this chart. It could be in an Excel sheet. It could be in a Word document. It could be in a PowerPoint, however you want to do it. But that's where those fit into our outcomes piece. Cool. So now we've actually walked all the way through half of this logic model. That outcomes category is covered up. We're good to go and ready to move into that process now.
Awesome.
So some real world tips on outcome determination. We've already talked a little bit about mission creep. Remember at the very beginning of this, I said, do your research. We don't want to be approaching problems that A, are already being solved very well by somebody else.
Absolutely.
That B, are just not really attainable, you know, or not realistic for us to be able to approach. Now, that doesn't mean stop trying to do good work. That just means take that, oh my gosh, huge thing and break it down into smaller components and maybe attack one of those.
Gotcha.
But importantly, on doing your research, is there, as you're thinking about these outcomes, is there a best practice or an evidence-based practice already associated with this desired outcome?
Yeah.
So, for example, one of our desired outcomes is that foster children will transition successfully by getting into supported or independent housing. Well, those terms, supported housing, independent housing, those are actually research-based terms that fit into a best practice model that already exists.
Okay.
So the great thing is you can go, I mean, we have this great research, what is it called, Steve? Google. That's right.
Google. Oh, that's it.
You can Google it. You can find these. They're not secrets. They're best practices.
Absolutely.
So you can find these and look, and when you're attacking this problem, you know, take a look and see, A, are there existing structures that I can take advantage of? B, is there a language I need to be using to talk about this problem?
That's huge.
Yeah.
That's
And then
huge.
at each outcome level, long-term, medium-term, short-term, what resource and services already exist that you can plug into?
So I'm just laughing because I know we're talking about foster children. I happen to hear your
My foster
foster
puppies.
your foster puppies. So now I know why you did this PowerPoint the way you did it, but
Yeah.
I get it now. I just
Yeah.
the beauty of Zoom and 2020.
Absolutely. Yeah. So they'll probably chime in, periodically. No big deal. As you're
We'll take a
thinking
pause
about,
at this slide so you can go figure out what's going on.
yeah, as you're thinking about these outcome levels, lead with the heart and plan with the brain, right?
1000%.
So, that's the number one issue where mission creep comes in, or where you get away from those desired outcomes that you
Yeah.
set in the first place, is you say, oh my gosh, because listen, working in the nonprofit industry for a long time, I have bawled my eyes out more times
Yeah.
than I care to count, and have really sat with some people in really difficult situations
Mm-hmm.
and said, gosh, I wish there was more I could do to help this person in this situation. What we need to do is remember, in those cases, we are using our best brain resources to come up with a plan to make the biggest impact for the most number of people.
Right.
And so, while we're leading with our hearts, we need to be planning with our brains.
1000%.
I mentioned earlier, don't plan in a vacuum.
Yep.
Seek out experts and ask good questions. I mean, you
Well,
can, again.
I was going to say, Jay, like you and I, when we were going into this, our good friend Wayne at the Venture Center, I spent countless hours with Wayne picking his brain. Why? Because he's done something like this before, and that's kind of what this is about. Is getting people to start. And so, man, if you've got a network, or even if you don't have a network, ask other people, hey, do you know anybody that is involved in this in any way, shape, or form? Because again, we mentioned it earlier, sometimes their best advice is how not to do stuff. Hey man, these are the grenades I fell on. Hey man, these are the pitfalls I saw. And so that's a huge, huge piece, man. Always seek out experts.
Yeah. And like you said, even if you don't have a network, you can call or email anybody.
Call
Just be
City
bold
Connections.
about it. Yeah, absolutely. Call City Connect. Who do I need to talk to? You could call the White House right now. You might not get to speak to the president, but somebody will talk to you and answer a question or point you in the right direction. So you can ask the experts, and at every level, the question you need to be asking, in our example, what is keeping these young people from attaining these goals right now? What are the obstacles to success in this area? Why is it like it is? Why do we do how we do? That's the question we're asking these experts is there something I'm missing here? Because it seems really simple.
Yeah.
Right. But we're asking these experts, why is it the way it is? And what are the obstacles? And finally, don't silo yourself right off the bat. Nonprofits, every industry has this tendency to work in silos and to be very laser focused on only what they're doing. And while you should be careful not to mission creep, one great way to prevent that, and one great way to work even better, is to seek out partners and map out those potential partners in your work. So that example earlier of one of your volunteers says, hey, we moved this kiddo who just aged out of the foster care system into a great apartment, but the pantry's bare. Okay, well then let's call the food bank, or let's.
I was going to say, I know we're going to talk about this down the road, but I tell the story all the time. When I was at Habitat, partnering at the food bank, so they did stock the pantries. And then what did we do? We started putting their barrels at the restores. So we collected food and working with Settled Souls to get people furniture. Well, what did we do? We helped Settled Souls store their stuff, but we picked up stuff. Recycled bikes for kids. We got a ton of bikes. So we'd give all of our bikes to them. When the kids would move into our houses, they would give brand new bikes to our kids. So finding those partnerships, that having someone else accomplish what is good and wonderful and beautiful and leading with your heart, but is within their mission, and working together. There's nothing more powerful than that. And that's why I love City Connections. And I I love working with you guys and all of our cohorts. So yeah,
Absolutely.
that's
So
huge.
yeah, as you're working on this outcome determination, don't just sit down at a table and write it all by yourself. Do your research,
Right.
ask the experts, talk with other people, lead with your heart, plan with your brain, and don't silo yourself right off the bat. Uh,
There we go. Are we there? Oh, see, my
we're
bad,
there.
guys. I'm learning. I'm learning. I accidentally hit pause on that deal. So sorry about that, J-Bug. So cool. We've got our outcome determination. And so I know what we're about to jump into. So let's just go, because
Yeah.
this is where my brain always starts to fry, is
Yeah.
the
So
outcomes
now,
versus outputs. But I know that we're talking about data versus heartfelt mission
yeah.
statements. And so
So I
it's like,
used those words qualitative and quantitative. Those are meaty academic words that basically mean qualitative is how are we measuring this with numbers, and qualitative is how are we measuring this, outside of hard data? How are we measuring this on, our outcomes? Most outcomes are qualitative by nature.
right,
Uh, so we want to spend a little time here on outcomes versus outputs, right? We're making the jump from our outcomes to our process, how we're achieving them. And the first process piece is outputs. And as we jump that bold line from outcomes to process, there's a lot of confusion and conflation between outcomes and outputs. It can be a real challenge to differentiate those, because a lot of times we're thinking, okay, if we're talking about outputs, well, isn't it an outcome if 20 people go through this program and complete our classwork? Isn't that an outcome? But that's an output, because we're talking about quantitative data. We're talking about the
right.
number of people who went through a number of classes and completed this piece of our program. So these things are confused and conflated really often, and it's easy to get them mixed up. But
But again, we're
again,
talking data versus
yep.
general solutions to what our problem is.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can see here that as I'm talking about, outputs, we're talking again about data. And with outcomes, we're talking about solutions to problem statements.
Hmm.
So for example, in your short-term outcomes, if we're talking about achieving achieving these outcomes, we're talking about what knowledge, skills, and abilities are we solving. So if then the problem statement is for a short-term solution, foster kids don't have a good foundation on financial knowledge, skills, or abilities. Okay, that's a solution to a problem statement. We're solving the problem. We're proving that we've solved the problem, that these young people have acquired this skill to be able to effectively manage, create and manage a budget. The output piece of that is, okay, well,
How many kids did
80%,
that? Yeah.
exactly. How many young people went through the classes on how to create a budget? How many young people, have successfully completed that program? So that's a little bit of the nuance between the output and the outcome.
Well, that next bullet is perfect. Outputs prove the impact of your outcomes.
That's
I mean,
exactly
it's
right.
data. We talk about weaponizing data all the time. Our good friend at our house, Ben Goodwin,
Hmm.
they do an amazing job of weaponizing their data to be able to
Yep,
tell that story for them. But without that data, they don't have those outcomes. You know what
that's
I mean?
right.
So it goes back and forth.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you're talking then about outputs proving the impact of outcomes, how do they do that? Well, if we're saying that we're going to build this knowledge, skills, and abilities, our output is that, this number of kids or this percentage of our participants
Sure.
completed this training. Um, a lot of times the outputs have to do with clarifying questions to measure the outcome progress. So just like we talked about setting those scalable, achievable goals that build on one another,
Yeah.
that's what you're creating with the output data. So you're clarifying questions here. We're moving backwards, right? From
Yeah. Yeah.
outcomes all the way back to that inputs piece. So we haven't talked yet about our activities, but we're going to say, what data would we need to see in order to prove that young people are developing these knowledge, skills, and abilities, or
Right.
impacting knowledge, skills, and attitudes? So most of the time, it's the best idea to focus your outputs on how are we creating changes in knowledge, skills, and or attitudes/abilities? Because again, as we talked about building those outcomes one on the other, if we achieve these short-term outcomes, then those changes in behavior or action are going to be a lot easier to accomplish.
Okay.
And if we achieve those changes in behavior or action, then that long-term change in condition or status in life is going to start to appear to us.
Cool. So are we going to dig back into this a little
Yep,
more too?
yep. We're asking those clarifying questions at each
Great.
stage. So then how do these outputs fit into your broader logic model? They're
Right.
data points that prove impact. They're linked primarily to short-term outcomes. What do we need to accomplish to impact this desired knowledge, skill, or ability? And how can we produce or measure this impact? So what data points do we need to produce? The best outputs are written as SMART goals. You may be familiar with SMART goals.
Yes. Well,
So
I am. Hopefully everybody else is.
yeah, well, SMART is an acronym. It means specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time bound.
Right.
So are we being specific in our goals? You know, are we using the data specifically? Are we able to measure the impact of what we're trying to do,
Right.
or how are we measuring that impact? Is this attainable? In other words, to differentiate attainable and realistic, do we have what we need to
Right.
create this data? Is this realistic? You know, are we trying to shrink the distance between the Earth and the Moon, or are we trying to do something, achieve a realistic goal? And then time bound. So, you know, is this just something that we're saying, hey, we hope one day this happens, or are we
Right.
saying in this period of time we will see this movement in the data? And I'll caution you when you're creating SMART goals and outputs. Linking results to outside factors can be tricky. So if one of your output is to say that 80% of our participants will score a 30 or higher on the ACT, well, there are a lot of factors that are impacting that.
Right.
So we want to take on things that we can impact, like, well, just to take it back to those outcomes, are we building a measurable difference in knowledge, skills, and abilities? Are
Right.
we producing changes in behaviors and activities with these young people that we're trying to impact?
Well, even, you know, your next two bullet points, you know, expressing that as a percentage, like we're going to
Yep.
increase the number of kids who do better in school. We're gonna
Yeah.
take it from 10 kids that got into good housing and transition well to 20 kids, or is that a percentage of the total kids? Yeah. So
Exactly. Yeah. So, you know, making sure that we're not linking those necessarily. And another example would be, you know, if you set one of your outputs or one of your outcomes even as, you know, a policy change. So we're going to change the law of this, that, or the other. That depends on hundreds of legislators.
Sure.
That's not going to be as good of an outcome or output as, you know, okay, well, this number of our clients achieved this goal. So, you know, I've got some great examples down at the bottom of good output language. So, you know, annually, 80% of clients will perform better in school as reflected by grade point average growth by academic quarter. So there it is. It's time bound. So each year, and then we have another time bound piece, academic quarters. It's measurable. 80% of our clients are going to see a growth in their grade point
Gotcha. I
average.
see it.
It's
Yep.
attainable. It's realistic. So these are good output statements that are very simple, but that are good examples of how to build that SMART goal language
Yeah.
into your output.
It's awesome.
Into your desired output. Notice that each of these is directly linked to one of our outcomes. So
Right.
just like we had that image of all of the different short-term building on medium-term building to long-term, these outputs are going to be, you should slot them into those short-term outcomes to measure those and how we're achieving them.
No, that makes sense.
So then how then, if we're going to say this is the data we're going to produce, how do we back that into the activities? Well, there's a real simple way to do it, is to say, okay, we need to produce this outcome. So then we need to be doing programming that helps students perform better in school. A reminder that activities are what we do to produce our outputs. They're the programs, methodologies, processes, and tools.
So they're essentially what we're doing to create the data.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Yeah. So then if you start with the data and say we need to see 80% of our students performing better quarter by quarter on their grade point average, okay, well then an obvious activity that jumps out is we need to do some tutoring,
Sure.
or we need to do, maybe one of the problems we identify is that those students need a safe place and some help doing their homework after school or things of that nature. So the questions to ask yourself as you're translating your outputs into your activities, and maybe even considering those together, is what is it going to take to meet these goals? What is it going to take to produce this data? And how will we know we're being successful?
Sure.
So these activities are sometimes, as I mentioned, implied or explicitly stated in your outputs. Again, if you're trying to produce this data, you need to do that through these tutoring sessions or these activities specifically. I'm going to say too that activities should be specific parts of a program, not the program itself. So you might say, oh, well, this is super easy. I'm going to break my educational attainment goal down into kids need tutoring. Well, that's great, right? But if we're going to specifically impact these problem areas, then we need to break it down. So academic assistance for foster youth is a program, not an activity.
Gotcha.
Outcomes and outputs are the forest, activities are the trees.
Gotcha.
So the individual pieces, right? So instead of saying just academic assistance for foster youth, let's talk about subject-specific tutoring for foster children in grades 9 to 12. See, we've zoomed all the way into, okay, this is what we need to do. And recognizing that, hey, kids in high school are going to need different kind of tutoring and different kind of interaction than kids in grades 4 to 8 in those middle school years.
Gotcha.
We're going to do resume building and interview coaching for foster children age 16 to 22. So again, these are parts of a program or activities inside of a program, not just an overarching program.
Well, no, and I love that because, going back to what we talked about at the beginning, I'm a let's go take the hill kind of guy. And I surround myself with lots of folks who say, well, yeah, Steve, what about these trees? What about this creek? What about this fence? And so, that analogy speaks really well to my brain, as far as here's the forest, but here's the trees. We got to plant trees to have a forest.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Love it.
So we're zooming in on these, and there's nothing wrong with starting by saying we need to produce some academic assistance for foster youth.
Sure.
You need to drill down into what are those classes going to look like? What are those sessions going to look like?
Gotcha.
And each of these activities is corresponding to a specific output for success measurement.
Love it.
So then how do you translate those outputs into activities, and how do you make sure your activities are going to be successful? I mentioned earlier evidence-based practices. A lot of evidence-based practices are tied to specific activities that you can do in these situations. So for example, when I'm working with Centers for Youth and Families or other groups who do a lot of very technical mental health work and other work with specific populations, there are libraries full of evidence-based practices. There are libraries full of suggested best practices. Those are, very, very tailored, what we call modalities and tools and implementations. We don't have to be that complicated, but depending on what sector you're working in, if you're trying to solve a problem, those are things you're going to need to know about. But those specific modalities, for example, if you're working with victims of sex trafficking and you want to use a very specific model of therapy, that's an activity.
Right.
So, and particularly with grant seeking programs, if you're going to want eventually to fund your work through grant programs, evidence-based practices or EBPs are really crucial. They're means tested solutions to problems. A lot of them have been run through academic journals and peer reviewed research processes. There are thousands of them. So you can literally go to that tool we mentioned earlier. I'm not sure how many people know about Google, but you can literally Google evidence-based practices in blank.
Whatever,
and
sure.
it'll pull up dozens of them for almost every problem. Some are as simple as one-to-one or small group literacy coaching is better than large group education for below grade level readers. Well, of course they are. I mean, some of them almost sound like common sense. And then, like I mentioned, some recommend very specific therapy modalities and get very complex.
Right.
I did not realize this until relatively recently, but as I was writing some federal grants, I realized and found that if you're looking for federal grants or even for state government, a lot of those agencies have libraries of existing evidence-based practices. Some of them even say, we want you to use this one.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, as you get further down the road with these ideas, or if you're a nonprofit looking to start a new program, you may want to consider some of these things. For now, like I said, I recommend just Googling evidence-based practices, reading through them, and making sure that you are lining up with some of the basic principles of those.
Sure.
Like, are we doing one-to-one or small groups, things of that nature. You can create your own evidence-based practices, because I hear a lot of nonprofits say, well, we can do our own research on this and make sure it's working and create the evidence, right? Because outputs are data.
Right.
So we are creating data and evidence, but you have to be very careful about creating your own EBPs. I don't recommend this if you are going to seek major grants. I recommend going with a peer-reviewed, journal-based, evidence-based practice.
Right.
But if you can back your approach with research and data, and you're looking at a local foundation grant or something of that nature, there's nothing wrong if you can back your approach with research and data with saying this is an evidence-based practice that we're using. You're just going to have to be able to prove that.
All right.
So let's talk about real world words on program activities.
Yes, please, because this is where, J-Buck, me, the last 10 minutes, I'm just like, my head's already spinning a little bit. And that's okay. I mean, I'm getting it. The more and more we talk about this stuff, the better prepared I am. And I'm actually looking at what we do at City Connections going, okay, we're doing this. And maybe not, maybe not doing it exactly how I need to do it, but we're on the right path.
Yeah. And, I wanted to spend a minute here, because a lot of times when programs come to me for consulting or coaching, they don't come to me with a program. They don't come to me with a logic model. They don't come to me with all of this kind of planning done. They come and they say, gosh, I see a lot of students who are not reading too well. And so what I want to do is I want to go one-on-one mentor these kids on reading. Well, that's an activity. That you're starting with the activity. And a lot of times that's where people's minds sort of migrate, or they say, oh, well, what I want to do is I want to, go and bring folks who are living unsheltered or who are homeless to an area and maybe show a Christmas movie and feed a meal and make it feel like a family activity.
Right.
Okay, that's great. That is an activity. And that's where a lot of people's minds start.
My grandfather used to say, Mijo, you're not seeing the forest for the trees.
Yeah,
you get caught up in the trees and you're not. So
like we talked about just a minute ago. I mean, it's easy to say, hey, I want to do this. So we want to be sure that we're being really intentional about these program activities. That's why we started with outcomes and then went to the data and then say, what activities is it going to take? So be sure to choose activities that are meeting the challenges and accomplishing the goals that you have just set. Ask the experts and do your research. So like I said, you can Google this. You can call up mental health experts that you know or foundation partners that you may know and ask them what they're seeing work well in these areas. Do your research and present solutions from your mind, not your gut. Because a lot of times, people will say, well, I see the problem. I know what we need to do to solve it. There's a great comic at the bottom from Dilbert. He says, oh, I'm managed by instinct and gut feelings. And he's saying, why are we doing this when the data says it won't work? Well, my gut tells me it's going to work. And there's nothing right. Steve, you and I are both very, very intuitive, very, very instinct-led leaders.
Right.
There's a place for that. On the planning table is not always where the place for that is.
Well, and look, J-Buck, there's a reason that this is happening right now,
Absolutely.
this webinar. And it's not because I just thought, well, this is something that we need to do. I mean, this has been
Hmm.
6 months of research, 6 months of
Yeah,
planning, 6 months of talking to experts, 6 months of presenting mind thought solutions to
absolutely.
what we're doing. And so, did I write it down like this?
Right.
Probably not. But I also had you along the way because you liked it, and our friend Wayne and our
Hmm.
friends at Fruoff, and just as we get into it, a lot of times it's asking people that crazy question. Hey, what do you think about this? Hey, what do you think
Yep.
about that? Because if people can buy into the forest, well, we can
Yeah,
start planting trees, but
absolutely.
we don't want to plant palm trees in Idaho.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a great analogy there. And we're remembering in this process that backward logic models, which is what we're talking about, they're about designing the best solutions, moving from outcomes to process, and it's done that way on purpose. Because
Yeah,
just like you said, we've got the big idea, and we know what the individual components are that it's going to take to put this in motion and make the best difference that we're going to make.
awesome. Well, my gut says that I should not listen to you, but we're going to keep. Okay.
You
Okay. Again, me and my fat fingers with this pause button. My bad.
So we're talking now about inputs. This is the last piece. If you think about that chart that we saw earlier, and we'll see
Backwards.
again
Yeah.
for reference, we're going backwards, and now we're at the final stop, which is inputs. A lot of people want to start here again. Just the same as folks come to me as a consultant and say, I have this idea for an activity to do this thing. A lot of people will come to me and say, not just I have this idea for this activity, but I need money to do this.
Right.
But we're going to talk about inputs very, very holistically. So remember
Okay.
that inputs are what we invest. That's not just money.
Right.
Mostly it's people, your staff, and your volunteers. Then, yes, funding is a piece of it. What physical properties or space, what research and training do we need to effectively do these activities to produce these outputs and these outcomes?
Right.
So a great way to do this is to ask yourself the classic who, what, when, and where. The
Yeah.
how and why are your activities and outputs.
I like that.
So as we're thinking about this logic model, think about who, what, when, where, how, and why. We've already covered the how and why. Those are
Yeah.
our activities, outputs, and outcomes. Now we're talking about who, what, when, and where. So who is going to carry out these activities? Who's going to do those tutoring sessions? Who's
Yeah.
going to do the one-on-one mentoring or whatever that activity piece
Yeah.
is? Who will do it? What will we need to do it? What will we need to carry out these activities? When will we host and work on these activities? And how
Mhm.
much time do we need to do it?
Right.
And where will we do our work and host these activities?
Mm.
So that's a great way to think about your inputs. Research and training are investments. You may have already done quite a bit of research and training by the time you get to this point in the process, because you're looking at evidence-based practices. You're looking at possible solutions to this problem that we're discussing. But research and training goes beyond that.
Right.
For example, if you're asking who's going to carry out our activities, who's going to do this tutoring, well, are those volunteers or staff members, are they going to need training to do that? Are
Sure.
we going to need to do some research on how best to implement that solution? And those are always investments. They take people, time, and money. Usually they
Right.
take all three. If you're working with volunteers, they at least take people and time and a lunch here and there.
Well,
So,
I was going to say the old development adage is, time, talent, and treasure.
yep,
So there you go. Talent's your people, time, well, it's still your time, and your treasure's your money.
yep.
But that is exactly right. We talk all the time. I'd sometimes much rather have 200 volunteers than $200.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So today we're going to focus mostly on people and funding,
Okay.
because those are the ones that spread out the best. Those are the
Yeah, yeah,
ones that are
yeah.
applicable to just about everybody. Everything else is going to be on pretty much a case by case basis. So talking about your people, your brand new programs and nonprofits will not likely have funding for salaries. Okay. So if we're starting up and saying, this project is an idea that we're trying to create, or this is a nonprofit that I want to launch, you are probably not going to start out with $1 million to do what you need to do.
If you are, call us and we'll help you.
Yes, absolutely. But, I think a lot of people say, man, I'm really passionate about this. This is what I want to spend my life doing. Gosh, how can I leave my $120,000 job to start this nonprofit?
Right.
Probably not,
Right.
We want to really think about that as you're considering launching a project or even a nonprofit. Excuse me, new programs at existing nonprofits. That's going to require long-term investment. I've had bosses in the past who told me that came from the for-profit sector and said, if you launch a new program or a new project, you should be seeing 20% growth year over year in revenue and outcomes. And I'm going, that is not how it works over here.
No.
Even if you're a very talented development director, 20% growth in funding or any other metric is really, really aspirational.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways. Now, that's not to say it's not doable,
Sure.
but it's not sustainable in the long term. So if you're an existing nonprofit, think about launching a new program or project. It's going to require at least 3 years of investment and tweaking and working on it. This is a long-term investment, not a moonshot that might burn up in the atmosphere.
Well, what do I say all the time? It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Absolutely. Yeah. So even if you can afford staff, though, even if you start with that $1 million, you're going to need and lean heavily on volunteers.
Right.
Not just volunteers to come in and bag lunches or do tutoring sessions. Board members are volunteers.
Yes.
They're your governing body, but those are volunteers. Some volunteers have subject matter expertise. So, thinking about what you need, if you need educators as volunteers because you have a specialized program, okay, that's a subject matter expertise. If you need some accountants or some bankers to do budgeting class, that is subject matter expertise.
Well, at City Connections with Operation Restore, we have an employment lawyer on our board. Why?
Yeah.
Because we run an employment agency. So trying to fit those in there is thinking about that part is huge.
So you're going to want to think about those needs that you have, map them out, and then target your volunteer recruiting to folks with those specific skill sets.
Right.
We're backward logic modeling here. So we're backfilling. We're kind of dreaming the dream together. So build the team you need in your plan. You may not know where all of these people are going to come from, but build yourself a dream team and start recruiting toward that. Another word of caution that I'll say, I see a lot of programs start out and they have great volunteers, or I see young nonprofits who say, oh, so-and-so has been volunteering with us since before we even started. Sometimes executive directors and even longtime volunteers expect that volunteer position to turn into paid work at some time.
Right.
Sometimes that happens and it works well. Very often we're using volunteers because we can't afford to hire a professional in this area. Now, maybe that volunteer builds the skill base over time, but generally speaking, when it's time to hire a professional in that role, you should either make sure that person has acquired the level of skill that you need them to be professionally accountable for those outcomes, or make sure that you're hiring someone into that position and that volunteer is ready to serve alongside that person and learn and grow even more. So that's just a kind of a word to the wise on early volunteer recruiting and things to keep in mind.
Well, setting those expectations.
Oh yeah, very important. Very important to set them. And, at the end of the day, if you're clear on that long-term outcome, if you're clear on what we're trying to accomplish here, and everyone is committed to that goal, well, then we're going to do whatever we need to do to achieve that goal, because it's about the goal. It's not about me feeling great about myself on a Saturday afternoon. It's about achieving this long-term outcome.
Yeah.
So I mentioned mapping your people. This is an exercise that I love to do with Post-it notes. We'll take a look at that here in just a second. Group your activities, even if you're not necessarily a visual person. Group your activities and programs by purpose or skill. Okay. So if you're grouping them by purpose, that might mean, okay, what outcome are we working on? What output goal are we working on? Are we working on the tutoring piece? Are we working on et cetera, et cetera? Grouping them by skill might mean, okay, we need people with experience in teaching in this area. We need people with experience in case management in this area,
Sure.
or any other area of expertise. So those are two different ways to group your activities. I recommend writing each activity on a Post-it note and then slapping them up on a whiteboard, or getting those people who are helping you flesh this idea out into a room, have them all write on Post-it notes and slap them up on a whiteboard. Then you're going to group them together and determine, okay, well, who do we need in place, or who do we need to make responsible for each of these groups of activities? Ultimately, it's all your responsibility. If you are the creator of this idea, or the person who's leading the charge, or in small nonprofit or even large nonprofit, if you're the executive director, it is all your responsibility to execute, and the board of directors' responsibility to oversee that execution. So think about, you cannot do it all yourself. Think about specific skills needed for each of those group of activities. And then I would recommend even going as far as to write a job description for each identified area of responsibility. Because even if you're filling that with a volunteer, like Steve said earlier, that sets a clear set of expectations. It describes the skill sets that you need to develop in that person or hire in that position. And it lays out the specific responsibilities and ties them to those outputs and goals. Yeah. So identify the people resources you need to accomplish your activities and produce your outcomes. So let's take a look at that Post-it note model that I talked about. These are obviously digital Post-it notes.
Really?
Yeah. So
thanks.
So when we're looking at these, I wrote in our foster care example, our foster kid example, I wrote out some of those short-term goals and some of those output goals that we had, and I just kind of splashed them up on some Post-it notes, like this is our digital whiteboard. Yeah. But you can see some common threads. So for example, I'm going to call your attention here to, okay, here's academic tutoring. Here's another, there's some more academic tutoring. Okay, there's some more academic tutoring. All right, great. Now here is some literacy coaching right here. Okay, but really that, to me, okay, that's more teaching skill, if I'm thinking by skill set. So there we go, literacy coaching. I'm grouping all of these. And so you can see that as I continue to go through and think about the different areas of responsibility and skill sets that we would need, I organize them into groups. So cool. Now here I've thought about, well, we've got up here, we're going to need folks doing some education and some one-on-one tutoring maybe. Okay, down here, we might need to pull in some folks from the job services area to come in and help us with resume and interview skills training. Up here, here's another skill set. How do we help people find affordable housing and get into it? Sure. And then here is a case management piece. Where are we referring these young people to when they need other services like medical care or basic documents and records or things like that? And how are we coaching them, very importantly, to transition from foster care? And then I thought of a whole nother group that I didn't even include up here, which is all the other stuff, right? All the other stuff. Yeah, everything else. The fundraising, the administration, the public relationship, the volunteer management, that's a leadership role there. So you can kind of see how I just grouped these. I chose to group them by the skill of the people that I would need in each of these areas so that we can produce these outcomes. And ideally, each of these areas has a program manager. So ideally, with that $1 million that we started our nonprofit. Yeah, because we got $1 million. So ideally, we're going to have somebody running our education programs. Ideally, we're going to have somebody running our housing programs, our job skills programs, and our case management programs. That is very likely going to start with volunteers. In any case, no matter what you're working on, very likely going to start with volunteers. And then, of course, here, everyone's favorite is the everything else category, which you, as the visionary, get to do. Hey, welcome to my world, J-Buck. All right, cool. So now that we got our Post-its up here, let's take just a quick pause. Everybody go grab a drink of water. We'll come right back with the next slide. Absolutely.
So now that we have thrown up all those Post-it notes and we've kind of gotten into that other box where the executive director has everything else, volunteers are handling everything else. Now let's talk about that board and what that board and that fundraising piece and how they could even work together maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. So on this slide, we're going to talk about this in a couple of different ways. First of all, if you are starting a brand new nonprofit, you're going to need a board of directors. You're going to need to build a board of directors. If you're not starting a new nonprofit, if you've got a project that doesn't require a 501c3 designation, or if you have a fiscal sponsor, or if you're a nonprofit that's launching out a new program, I still highly recommend building a committee, not a board of directors, but some kind of committee of very highly invested volunteers who can help you out with some of these needs that you have.
Right.
For new nonprofits, boards of directors are crucial. And, we're talking about executive directors, which is the chief executive officer of any nonprofit, is generally called an executive director. Your executive director is overseen, hired and fired by a board of directors, but they run like a twin engine jet. And if they're pulling together, that thing's going to fly. If they're not, we have a problem. So boards of directors are crucial, especially for brand new nonprofits. If you're starting a new nonprofit, you need at least 3 of them anyway. I mean, that's the law. And opinions are split on whether you should serve on the board if you're going to be doing the work. So, a lot of times if you're starting a new nonprofit, you say, well, of course I want to be on the board. This is my idea and my baby, and I want to make sure that it's governed correctly and it goes in the right direction. I hear that all the time. Generally speaking, if you are not going to take a paycheck from that organization, there's not a big conflict of interest in serving on the board.
Right.
The concern is if you're being paid by that organization, or if a company that you own is being paid by that organization for some service, there's a potential for conflict of interest in your governance. So as a general rule, if you're being paid by that organization, you should never hold a voting seat on the board. That doesn't exclude you from the board. Like Steve's the executive director, so he sits on his board of directors in an ex officio capacity, which means by virtue of my office. When I was an executive director, I always sat on the board ex officio. And if at any time my board needed to discuss my payroll or some kind of sensitive HR matter, they could go into executive session. I would leave the room, come back afterward, and we would talk through the rest of our business.
Right.
So generally speaking, if you're getting paid by a nonprofit, you should reject holding a voting seat on the board and only hold an ex officio.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean you don't get to cast vision and lead, but the boards, you're essentially working for the board at that point.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Now these boards and committees are great places for you to gather key skills. When I'm advising somebody who runs a nonprofit, I always say, who's on your board? And sometimes before they even tell me who's on their board, I say, do you at least have an attorney, a CPA, and somebody who knows what they're talking about?
Yeah.
Because those are 3 key skill sets that you are going to need. You're going to need an attorney you can call without paying per billable hour. Absolutely. And just ask a quick question. You're going to need an attorney you can shoot over an MOU. Hey, could you just scan this, make sure it's good. You're going to need a CPA to tell you about, your any banking matters, to help you with financial statements, to help you with if you need an audit or filing your 990.
And like I was saying before, imagine the billable hours that attorney is writing off, that CPA is writing off. Again, would you rather have that money to pay somebody, or would you rather have that person that's there and you can take that money and apply it to another program, apply it to something else? And so
absolutely,
being very strategic about that beginning board is huge.
Yeah. So those are great tips on who to include in some of your leadership conversations, early conversations, and a great way to gather those skills that you need that you may not have yourself. The other important area of inputs that we're going to talk about today is your funding. I've got over here, a little reminder screen of what your inputs are. They're your project resources. So as we're talking about funding, when you're writing this logic model, cast that vision and plan/budget to fulfill it.
Right.
So you're saying, hey, in an ideal world, we're producing this outcome and these medium-term and short-term outcomes, and we're producing these activities, and we need these people. In an ideal world, this is what we need to accomplish this goal. And
I know
remember
what the
that.
question's going to be from everybody.
Mhm.
Man, are we going to have a whole other webinar here right now, right here? Well, no, but we're going to cover this hardcore
Yeah.
in the Quarry, in the Impact Accelerator. So this is
Mhm.
just dipping our toe in.
Absolutely. So we're coming to funding last on
Yeah.
purpose because we've already mapped out our people. We've already thought about what physical space we may need, what research, training, and other resources we need. So we're going to come to funding last.
Because it's going to cost something.
That's right. If I can't find those people I need, what is it going to cost? So what paid staff will we need to invest? What will we need to, what resource will we need to attract and retain volunteers? Guys, even if you're planning on filling that people need with volunteers, do something. I mean, even if it's pizza parties, I mean, if you're going and buying $5 hot and red, it doesn't matter. Do something for those volunteers to show that you appreciate them and that you support the work that they're doing, and get them the resources they need to do their work.
Absolutely.
What physical space do we need to carry out programming, and what is that going to look like or cost? Are we doing these programs in schools? Are they going to allow us to do that? Do we need to rent a space at a local facility? Can we get a room at the library? What's that going to look like? What skills or knowledge do we need to acquire? And what other resource will we need? And then what's all this going to cost? I recommend you build 2 budgets. Okay. Build your dream budget and say, hey, if everybody was getting paid and if everything was coming in, this is what it would look like. And then build a bare bones budget. So, hey, if we could not find the money for all the people and what do we need as far as supplies and things to actually carry this out? And that's a nonprofit concept called scarcity versus abundance.
Sure.
I actually recommend this with a lot of my nonprofit clients, is to build 2 budgets for their boards at the same time, and then find some middle room, for your actual budget. But balancing scarcity and abundance is super important. And Steve's right. We'll discuss budgeting and funding your project in a later training. We want to hit this as far as what does it have to do with your logic model,
right?
And what's the puzzle piece that it fits into?
Well, and God willing, we can do that at one of our first actual live classes, because I think
Absolutely.
That's always number one question, or number one thing. Well, gee, what does your nonprofit need? Money?
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Okay, great. That we know that. So let's not worry about it. But let's not worry about that piece right now. Let's worry about what do you need to make it happen, and then again, how do we backfill?
Yeah.
And whether that be through volunteers, through gift in kind, through whatever. And so
and to your point on we always need money, I've started doing something in my consulting practice where I say, what is your number one problem? As I'm doing a discovery consultation, hey, what's your number one problem that we need to tackle together? And it's always funding. And so then I'll say, cool. We're not going to tackle that today. So tell me your number 2 problem. What is your number 2 problem? So, because what I've also found is if you dig into that number 2 problem, that's why the money's not coming.
That's exactly right.
If your number 2 problem is that, we don't have the right people in the right places, of course the money's not going to come.
That's exactly right.
If your number 2
culture's messed up, or
or if your number 2 problem is, we can't find kids to put in these programs, nobody's going to fund an empty classroom. Of course the money will come. Right. So usually the reason you're having your number 1 problem, which is we don't have enough money to do this, is because there's some other underlying issue that's going on there. And sometimes it's like, we just haven't done any strategic planning in 5 years. Or sometimes it's we don't have a written development strategy. Those are all things that I can help with. But if we can't address those things, I can't help you find money, no matter how good I am. Yeah. So
you're not that good.
The funding piece is super important. We're going to cover that in a lot more depth later in this series for our accelerator cohort. So that brings us to, now we've hit every piece of these logic models. So your first step is to produce this deliverable logic model. If you're going to join us in our accelerator cohort, which I very highly encourage you to do, this is your first deliverable. So we'll be taking a look at the logic model that you produce. I mentioned earlier, your logic model does not have to look like this. You don't have to fit it into, 2-inch by 2-inch boxes on a word screen. You can address these inputs, activities, outputs, short, medium, and long-term outcomes in a Word document, a PowerPoint, an Excel, however works best for you to communicate those ideas, as long as you address each of those areas and align them the way that we've kind of been talking about today in this first workshop.
Mm-hmm.
I'm more than happy for anybody to email me your first draft logic model. Or if you're a nonprofit and you're watching this and you already have a logic model or a theory of change built, send it to me. Maybe tell me what you're looking for, because my instinct is going to be to look at it and say, hey, it has this strengths and these weaknesses. But if you're the kind of person who just says, hey, I just want somebody to shoot holes in this, then I will get out the idea Gatling gun and shoot holes in it, and we'll address those together. I mentioned, if you're going to join us in this Collaborative Impact Accelerator cohort, that's where we get a lot more in depth on that one-to-one coaching.
Right.
And in bringing some more of those resources to bear, not only in these workshops that we're going to be doing for those cohort members, but in the in-between time where we're checking in with you weekly to say, hey, how's that logic model coming? Oh, well, I'm having trouble with this, and I've rewatched the thing, but I can't figure it out. Okay, cool. Let's work through it together one-on-one. So go to cityconnectionsinc.org, click on the Quarry, and sign up for that Collaborative Impact Accelerator, because it's going to make a big difference.
And we talked earlier about setting expectations.
Mm-hmm.
Look, we know things are a little different right now, and so we're going to be doing some of these things just like we're doing today, and we're going to be involving groups, and we can do a lot here. But again, as we get through this trying time, we're going to meet as a group here at City Connections, and we're going to be one-on-one, and we're going to be grinding through different things. But this is the first step. J-Buck mentioned it. So go to cityconnectionsinc.org, get signed up for the first accelerator. There's an application on there. It comes to us. We go through the applications, and we're going to try and do exactly what we talked about with the board. Is we're going to try and take in a nice, well-rounded group of folks, folks from different areas, so that you can collaborate with one another, and you're not stepping on toes, and you can grow your capacity through those networks. So I implore you to go to the website and check it out. And again,
absolutely.
I say it all the time. I've said it since I walked in. I want to make a dent in the universe. And I think as nonprofit professionals, we should all want to make that dent in the universe. So
absolutely. And to your point, not only as nonprofit professionals are we trying to make a dent in that universe, Steve and I have worked with so many phenomenal volunteers over the years who work in the private sector. They have a huge heart for some issue. Maybe it's animal rescue. Maybe it's a specific illness or type of cancer that's affected their family life. So these ideas come from anybody and everybody. And certainly this accelerator is open to anybody and everybody who has an idea for a project or a way to make a dent in the universe. As we mentioned earlier, we're going to continue this training session, whether we have to do it online or if things get safer to meet in person where we can do that collaboratively in the same space. We're going to be doing this each month. So our first session here, Logic Models and Theories of Change, you are here. This is the course we're doing now. Next up comes that collaboration piece, then volunteers, then that Golden Goose funding workshop we're going to present, followed up by communication, leadership and ethics, and our pitch competition. You'll also, as we mentioned, have regular contact with a community action coach and input from folks like Steve and other nonprofit professionals and assistants producing those monthly project deliverables. And
I think that's, we talked about this originally, and we've got really good friends over at the Clinton School of Public Service. A lot of the folks that are going to come and speak have graduated from that program. And I know that as a guy who has his associate's degree but didn't have an opportunity to go to a school like that, as Justin said, I got my knowledge on the streets when it came to nonprofit, doing it for 25 years. Some of those lessons are just as important as, the, what is it, $20,000-$30,000 a year tuition at the Clinton School, maybe more.
Well, that's a great point, that there are fantastic places where you can pick up some of these skills,
Absolutely.
in the academic world, especially. The Clinton School of Public Service has a great program.
Phenomenal.
The University of Arkansas, Little Rock has a great nonprofit management certificate program. Those are fantastic. But if those are either out of your price range, or you don't have the time to commit to those, or if you are looking for, this kind of hands-on experience, where we're not here to compete with those programs.
No.
We're here to add value to this community of difference makers and make it even more accessible for folks to get and be part of this cohort collaborative model that we're building at the Collaborative Impact Accelerator.
Yeah.
So I threw up our contact information here. You can get a hold of us, either one, by email or by checking out our websites and learn some more. Get in touch with us, and let's get cracking on these community impact projects.
Yeah, we're excited. And like I said, if you guys have any questions at all, holler at us. We're still taking applications all this month of April, and the goal is to launch our first class in May. So this is, if you will, the I don't know, what did you call it, Jay Buck? The dress rehearsal?
Your introductory session, yeah.
Yeah, your introductory session. Now for just $19.95, you can get the rest of the series. But we appreciate you guys tuning in. Please share this with anybody that, as Jay Buck said, anybody that you know is grinding on an idea and wants to make a dent in the universe. Share it with that person. Share it with a small business person. Share it with your grandma, grandpa, aunt, uncle, and let's spread the word and try and go make a real difference. We appreciate y'all's time. We love you, and we look forward to hearing from you very soon. Have a great day.